Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of Peter Sullivan. First I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Peter Sullivan was born in the mid-1950s and lived in Liverpool, England. He was described as a quiet loner who had a learning disability. Peter had once worked as a laborer, but by 1986 found himself unemployed. That same year, a 21-year-old woman named Diane Sindel lived in Seacombe, which is in Liverpool. She worked for a flower shop owned by her family. Diane also worked part-time at the Wellington pub in Bebington, 5 miles south of her home. She was saving money for her wedding, which was planned for 1987. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On Saturday, August 2, 1986, at 12:30 p.m., Diane Sindel's partially clothed body was found in an alley off Borough Road in Birkenhead, about 3 miles north of the bar where she worked. Here is what the police found during the course of their investigation. Diane died from a cerebral hemorrhage caused by multiple blows to her head. She sustained skull fractures, bruises, cuts, had severe bite marks on her body, and had been the victim of an assault of a sexual nature. Semen was recovered from Diane's body, but no DNA profile could be generated. DNA testing technology was in its early stages and extremely limited. The first case in the UK where DNA was used to solve a serious crime was the same year as Diane's murder, 1986. The police were able to piece together what happened to Diane. On Friday, August 1, 1986, at 11:45 p.m., Diane left her part-time job at the Wellington pub, driving a blue Fiat pickup truck used by her family's flower shop. On the way to her residence in Seacombe, the truck ran out of fuel on Borough Road. While she was walking to a gas station, she was attacked, dragged into an alley, and murdered. At around midnight, now on Saturday, August 2, 1986, a taxi driver saw a man and a woman arguing on the side of Borough Road. Sometime between 12:30 a.m. and 2 a.m., witnesses heard screaming. The keys to Diane's pickup truck were found 1,200 feet from her body at 2:30 a.m. As I mentioned, Diane's body was discovered in the alley at 12:30 p.m., over 12 hours after she ran out of fuel. On August 17, 1986, 15 days after the murder, Diane's fire-damaged clothing was found about 5 miles from where her body was discovered. A couple who was passing by on August 3 said they observed a man running from a small fire in that area. They claimed they recognized the man as Peter Sullivan. On September 23, 1986, Peter was arrested on suspicion of murder. He gave officers a number of conflicting accounts of his movements for August 1 and August 2. After this, Peter broke down in tears and confessed to murdering Diane. Later that same day, he recanted his confession, only to confess again not long afterward. When Peter was given access to an attorney on September 25, he recanted his confession for the last time, claiming that he had been pressured and confused by the police. In addition to the confession, the police had other evidence against Peter Sullivan. For example, he borrowed a crowbar from a neighbor prior to the murder. A couple said that he was running from a small fire in which Diane's clothing had been burned. Not long after the murder, Peter left for London. An expert claimed that his teeth matched a bite mark on Diane. And on the day of the murder, investigators believed that Peter had consumed a large quantity of alcohol and lost a game of darts. From the perspective of the police, this was a bullseye. Peter Sullivan went to trial for murder. He was convicted in November 1987 and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 16 years. He challenged his conviction in 2008, but the Criminal Cases Review Commission refused to grant him permission to bring his case to the Court of Appeal. In 2019, Peter requested permission to appeal, and the request was rejected. In 2021, Peter tried for a third time and was successful in getting his case heard. By this time, DNA testing technology had advanced significantly. In 2024, it was determined that the DNA found on Diane Sindel belonged to an unknown male. it did not match Peter Sullivan. The DNA was also not a match to over 260 men identified during the original investigation, including Diane's fiancé or any member of her family. The police have no idea who the DNA belongs to, and they are concerned they may never know. On May 13, 2025, Peter Sullivan, now 68 years old, had his murder conviction overturned after spending over 38 years in prison. More precisely, Peter had been in prison for 14,113 days. Outside the court, his attorney said, quote, "This is an unprecedented and historic moment. Our client, Peter Sullivan, is the longest-serving victim of a miscarriage of justice in the UK. He has endured nearly 40 years in a Category A prison for a truly horrific crime that he did not commit. Today, justice has been at last served, and his conviction has been quashed," unquote. In a statement, Peter indicated that he was neither angry nor bitter, saying, quote, "I am simply anxious to return to my loved ones and family, as I've got to make the most of what is left of the existence I am granted in this world," unquote. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. In the UK, a wrongly convicted individual can claim compensation through the miscarriage of justice compensation scheme. If the individual was incarcerated for less than 10 years, the maximum compensation is £500,000. For 10 years in prison or more, the maximum is £1 million. Peter spent over 38 years in prison, so in theory he could receive up to £1 million. But it is not quite that simple. In order for Peter to collect the money, he must prove that he is innocent beyond a reasonable doubt. This is a high standard and one that very few wrongly convicted individuals are able to achieve. Out of 591 wrongful conviction compensation applications submitted between 2016 and 2024, only 39 were approved for payments. Those 39 payments only totaled £2.4 million. In addition, the process to approve compensation takes an average of almost 2.5 years. Item number 2. Peter Sullivan's case is believed to be the longest-running miscarriage of justice in British history. It seems pretty clear he was falsely convicted. A lawyer for the Crown Prosecution Service told the Court of Appeal, quote, "We do not seek to argue that this fresh DNA evidence does not undermine the safety of the appellate's conviction. Had this DNA evidence been available at the time a decision was taken to prosecute, it is difficult to see how a decision to prosecute could have been made," unquote. A spokesperson for the Criminal Cases Review Commission said that despite the DNA evidence not being available in 2008, the organization did, quote, "regret that we were not able to identify Mr. Sullivan's conviction as a potential miscarriage of justice in our first review," unquote. From a mental health perspective, wrongfully convicted people released after spending decades in prison face a number of potential difficulties. For example, stress, frustration, and disorientation from having to adjust to the technology of the modern world, like smartphones and the internet. Confusion and terror adjusting to modern culture, like the rise of Kim Kardashian and NFTs. Symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder from living in a state of hypervigilance for years, moving from an institutional environment to one with freedom, can lead to a sense of uneasiness and a lack of confidence. Coping with the loss of every major adult milestone could be challenging, like being denied the ability to establish a career or to build a family. Tremendous grief from the life that was lost. In Peter's case, 38 years were stolen from him. The enormity of this loss may make it difficult to rebuild a sense of purpose. And a person in Peter's situation would probably never be able to trust the criminal justice system again. In my opinion, compensation of £1 million is not enough to remove the weight of the false conviction from Peter's shoulders. Item number 3, what do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. When Diane was murdered, the police did not have any good leads. They were probably concerned they would never apprehend the killer. Their best evidence was the DNA found on Diane's body. DNA is extremely helpful in solving crimes these days, but not particularly helpful back in 1986. Again, there were no good leads at that time. When witnesses suggested that Peter Sullivan could be responsible, the police decided he was guilty. A mental health professional who assessed Peter later indicated that he had limited intellectual capacity and was suggestible. Perhaps the police took advantage of this during the interview and pressured Peter to confess. They also made no effort to supply him with legal representation, later claiming that doing so would have constituted a, quote, hindrance to the enquiry, unquote. At Peter's trial, the jury was strongly influenced by his confession, and he was convicted. Ultimately, the incompetent behavior of the police victimized Peter. Law enforcement also dishonored Diane by not finding the person who actually killed her. Now they are once again searching for her killer almost 40 years after her murder. There is a decent chance that the offender is still alive because he was probably young when he committed the crime. Finding him, however, will be difficult. His DNA is not in the National DNA Database, which means he has never been arrested for any recordable offense in Britain. If the perpetrator managed to avoid being arrested all this time, it is unlikely he will be arrested now. So his DNA will never be collected. The best hope the police have for solving this case is probably something like genetic genealogy. This is expensive and time-consuming, but it has been successfully used in several high-profile murder cases. Even if the police somehow find the perpetrator, there is no guarantee of a conviction. The perpetrator's lawyers can use the false conviction of Peter Sullivan in his defense, arguing that Peter was the real killer. After all, he had been convicted of the crime. They could point out that just because Peter was exonerated doesn't mean he was not guilty in reality. The perpetrator may explain his DNA on the victim by saying they had consensual sex before someone else murdered her. This would probably not be an effective defense because it is clear Peter is innocent and the presence of the DNA is highly inculpatory. However, the case would not be open and shut. Falsely convicting Peter Sullivan caused a lot of complications in this case. Everyone was denied justice. Now moving to my final thoughts. When I'm researching a topic for a video, I try to get a sense of what the people in the story were experiencing and identify major themes in their lives. For example, were their lives chaotic or organized, free or restricted, unsatisfying or fulfilling? Did they have access to resources? How many friends did they have? Were they connected to their community? To help understand the situation being analyzed and connect with the subject of the video, I include imagery which is relevant, like photographs of the perpetrator, the victim, the crime scene, vehicles used in the story, murder weapons, houses, and other appropriate images. Sometimes this is not possible because there are not many images available, like in the case of Peter Sullivan. One thing I've noticed over the years is how the number of images available for any particular subject is roughly associated with how difficult that person's life was. So fewer images would generally mean the person's life was more challenging. Now, this, of course, is not a scientifically validated theory, rather just an observation that I've made. It is something that tends to be true, but of course there are exceptions. For instance, I've covered cases of people who had extremely rough lives, and every moment was captured by an image. The case of Gary Coleman comes to mind, a child actor who played on the TV sitcom Different Strokes. Another consideration is how this basic image quantity assessment technique has to be adjusted for the time when the story occurred. One would not expect as many images to be available for older cases. Taking pictures was relatively difficult and expensive in the 1960s and 1970s. It was only slightly easier in the 1980s. The ability to take a lot of photographs cheaply did not become common until digital technology started to catch on in the early 1990s. The advent of social media in the early 2000s gave people a compelling reason to use digital technology to take a lot of photographs. These days, it's remarkably common for any given person to have hundreds, if not thousands, of images available of themselves. I'm convinced that someday people will record their entire lives on video. There will be no more true crime mysteries. Moving back to my theory, why is this the case? Why do fewer images usually mean a rougher life? I think this association exists because many positive attributes are connected with the ability and desire to take a lot of pictures. For example, having access to technology, having money, going on vacation, being romantically connected, having friends, being active in work or school. People tend to document positive experiences by taking photographs and recording videos. They want other people to see what they're doing. This is different for people who are miserable. They don't want to show others what is going on in their lives, so they would tend not to take pictures. Again, this is a theory, just a curious observation, but here's why I mention it. Many people tend to use quick assessment techniques when interacting with others. I have met people who draw immediate conclusions when confronted by various situations. For instance, they may judge people based on perceived levels of education or wealth. They may think less of a person based on weight, fashion choices, jewelry, tattoos, or even the types of shoes being worn. Making assessments like these may just be a humorous or academic exercise for some, but for others, they are confident in the predictive power of these observations. Maybe that's what happened in the case of Peter Sullivan. The police looked at him and saw someone with an intellectual disability. Immediately, they thought, this guy must be the killer. Peter was never given the benefit of the doubt. Instead, he was the victim of a snap judgment using a flawed assessment method. Those are my thoughts on the case of Peter Sullivan. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.